Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. Today we ask, what does it mean to be holy? Does holiness divide or unite us? So settle down and cut yourself a slice of pie for this week's episode, Divide and Sanctify. Okay, well, welcome to another week of Madlik Disruptive Torah. And as we were talking about in the pre-show, usually Kedoshim, the parsha that we have this week, is kind of wrapped with Achrei Mot, the parsha that we read last week. So it kind of gets buried in the lead. And it's rather exciting to me, at any rate, to have the focus today just on the parsha of Kedoshim. And I must say that there is an Israeli expression that I heard recently that just amuses me because secular Jews say it. When they quote somebody who's passed away, they say, Achrei Mot Kedoshim Emor. Is that correct, Rabbi?
That is what they say.
And all that is doing, and I've heard that from secular Jews, so it's kind of become part of the just standard expressions. It combines the first name of the three parshiot, and it means after death, you are holy in what you say. And so when you quote somebody who's passed away and you give them a little extra credit, you say, Achrei Mot Kedoshim Emor. And I just always love instances where things that are innocuous, Jewish, halachic, biblical laws have entered the speech of everyday Israelis.
It's a great saying, isn't it?
Yeah, I love it. So anyway, we are in Leviticus 19 and 20. And what I am going to do, the word Kedoshim means holy, as I said in the intro. And I believe that we are all going to be surprised by what the Bible considers holy. And so what I'm going to do is kind of read verses selectively, because my bias is normally when we think of something that's holy, we think of ritual, we think of taboo, that you can't touch it, that it's pure. And I think you'll be surprised by where the emphasis of the holiness is. So let's dive right in. God spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the whole Israelite community and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, your God, am holy. You shall each revere your mother and your father and keep my Sabbaths. I, God, am your God. You shall not pick your vineyard bare or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, Hashem, am your God." That's the kind of repetition. You shall not steal. You shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of God. I am Hashem. You shall not defraud your fellow Israelite. You shall not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. You shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am Hashem your God. You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kin fairly. Do not deal basely with members of your people. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow Israelite. I am Hashem your God. You shall not hate your kinfolk or in your heart. Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. You shall not take vengeance nor bear a grudge against members of your people. Love your fellow Israelite as yourself. That's the famous V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall observe my laws, I am Hashem. You shall not let your cattle mate with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed. You shall not put on a cloth from a mixture of two kinds of material. If a man has carnal relations with a woman who is a slave and has been designated for another man, but has not been redeemed or given her freedom, there shall be indemnity. They shall not, however, be put to death. death, since she has not been freed. I kept on reading the last part because that's, I think, what most of us predicted would be here. There would be laws of sexual unchastity. There would be laws of mixing the seed of flax, these chukim that we had talked about earlier. But that's almost the end of it. In the middle, all of these laws don't normally refer to us as the holiness laws. And the fact that it starts by saying kind of, you shall be holy because I am holy. God doesn't have these kinds of relationships. He doesn't pay his workers, so to speak. So to me, it's a really radical definition of holiness. Are you struck in that way as I am, Rabbi?
Well, I'm struck by the definition of holiness. I'm struck by the fact that the Torah waited until the middle of the book of Vayikra to talk about holiness. If it's so central, shouldn't the Torah start that way? It kind of sneaks up on us here, doesn't it?
Well, maybe we've been preparing for this all this time, right? Maybe we need to be...
Well, that itself is a Dvar Torah. That Dvar Torah says that we weren't ready to be holy yet. We needed all the Torah up to now to get to holiness. I wonder whether that's true. That's a nice Dvar Torah. I wonder whether that's true.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the other thing which comes out clearer in the Hebrew than it does in the English is this kind of, I wouldn't say it's a sing-song, but it's like, it starts by saying, I am holy, therefore you should be holy. And then it rolls out one or two or three verses and it repeats. It has like a drum beat. I am your God.
That's the refrain. And that's the refrain from the first verse. Be holy because I'm holy, and because I am your God, because I am your God. It seems to be that either God is seen as having these moral traits, or we need to have moral traits because God is our God. Meaning that we need to be moral. That's part of our religious obligation. You don't need to say, fast on Yom Kippur because God is God, because that's a part of the ritual. But to be moral, you may think that has nothing to do with God. The answer is yes, Ani Hashem, it's only because God is God.
So one fascinating interpretation, and I think one of the themes that we are going to kind of find today, and it's something that always impacts me, is those of you who have ever studied higher biblical criticism, where they look at the texts of the Torah as though they're written in different formats, possibly they were edited and put together. If after you study the higher biblical critics, you go back and study the traditional rabbinic interpretations, you find that this is not a discovery. The rabbis themselves could, because they lived this language and they lived these laws, they were very attenuated to when there was a change in types of phraseology. So one rabbi, Rabbi Chia, taught this section, and he says, Parasha Zu was spoken in the presence of a gathering of the whole assembly, because most of the essential principles of the Torah are attached to it. Rabbi Levi said because the Ten Commandments are included therein. And I quote this in brief, but it goes on to map, literally map, every one of the Ten Commandments onto these verses. And the what I want to focus on for a second is, number one, that the rabbis call it this parsha. You don't really, this whole sense of having Parshat HaShavua, you don't really find references in the Talmud. Correct me if I'm wrong, Rabbi.
No, you're 100% right.
To Parshat Noah.
In the time of the Talmud, in many places, they had a triennial cycle. They didn't finish the Torah every year. They finished it every 3 years. So therefore, they didn't have Parshat HaShavua the way we have it. That was something that developed only over the centuries. That's absolutely right.
But not only that, you'll never get in the Talmud where they refer like we saw in Parshat Noach, or what we saw in Parshat Mishpatim. They do have a concept of Parsha. And when they refer to a parsha, they mean a chapter, a piece that's clearly unique and stands on its own. And that's why, again, I find if you study the rabbis in that way, after you study higher biblical criticism, they're really talking about the same thing in different manners. So the first thing is this Rabbi Chia talks about this parsha, and he's not talking about Parshat HaShavua. He's talking about this segment that is clearly stands on its own and is one literary unitary piece. And then he says that this is a piece that was said in public. And of course, the word that he uses, b'ha'ke'el, and we know that there's a commandment to gather all the people at certain times and to read from the Torah, a biblical commandment. So he is really saying this is a very, very important piece. And then when you add to that this Rabbi Levi, who says it's really a restatement, or I'd say a parallel presentation of the Ten Commandments, that becomes fascinating.
That's fascinating. I mean, first of all, it's interesting about the Ten Commandments. So, we are all sensitized to the fact that the Ten Commandments are what we like to call the top 10 commandments, means the top 10 laws. But actually, that's not the way the Torah presents them. The laws in the Ten Commandments are not somehow more important than, the little laws, the laws of shatnez, the prohibition against wool and linen. The idea in the Torah is that all laws are of equal importance. So that's interesting, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. But nonetheless, as much as we try to, the issue that you raise is a complex one, because many non-Jews would come to us and try to focus on the Ten Commandments. So, for instance, there was a custom to stand for the Ten Commandments, and then people said, well, if we just stand for the Ten Commandments, that might be an interpretation that it's more important, and that laws like shatnez don't mean as much. So they say, well, stand for the whole thing. So it was a sensitive issue, but there's no question. At the end of some of these restatements, it does say these are the Ten Commandments, even if it's not the one that we target. There's something, call it numerology. There is something packed about Aseret HaDibrot, because obviously Moshe came down with the Ten Commandments. You can't dilute that. So
that they used to say the Ten Commandments in services every single morning. They only changed that because Christianity thought that the Ten Commandments were the only commandments that you had to listen to. And in order to prove the Christians wrong, they took that out of the Torah, out of the davening. But they used to say it in the davening.
So this is an ongoing theme in Madlik, where the way we Jews practice and study our Judaism has, through better or worse, been affected by non-Jews, by Christians, by others, whether we have been a reflex against that or simply other dispositions. But absolutely, what you're just saying is what I was trying to say. And so there's no question that this is a very important segment. Now, one of the things, and I think Henry even mentioned it last week, because he read this portion as his bar mitzvah, the second half of our portion today talks about all the forbidden sexual relationships. And I think even last year for this podcast, we focused on same-sex and the prohibition against same-sex. It's all at the end of this portion. And because we operate in this portion of the week, we tend to lump them together. But I want you to listen very carefully to Vayikra Rabbah. Vayikra Rabbah says as follows. Rabbi Judah ben Pazi asked, why was the section dealing with consanguineous relationships placed next to the section dealing with holiness? So in Hebrew, it says, why was Parshat Arayot connected to La Parshat Kedoshim? So the rabbis understood that these were two totally different sections. And just like sometimes they ask, why are the laws of the Sabbath connected or juxtaposed to building the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and they learn something from it? Here too, these two sections were clearly different. And the laws of the forbidden, incestuous, and other relationships is not kedoshim. It's arayot. It's a section that deals with that topic. And that, too, is fascinating to me because it does impact what kedoshim is. We can ask why they were put together, but kedoshim by itself doesn't include those things.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what do you make of that?
So again, it absolutely emphasizes what I took away when I read Kedoshim this year afresh. And what I was reading about is, yes, there was some things about the Sabbath. We'll get to that maybe in a second. And clearly it did talk about the mixed species. But for the most part, when it says, be holy because I am holy, because I am your God, it's about paying the laborer on time. It's about having scales that are correct. It's about telling the truth. Even when it talks about not taking God's name in vain, it means when you swear an oath against somebody else. It is so interpersonal, it is so social that I think it's a revolutionary interpretation of a term that we typically associate with ritual and taboo and those types of things.
I think that's right. I'll just tell you, there's an interesting, in these months between Pesach and Shavuot, there's a tradition each week to study Pirkei Avot. And Pirkei Avot, which is the ethics of the father, the laws of morality, begins Moshe Kibel Torah B'Sinai and Masara Yoshua. It has the list of the transmission. Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai and passed it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the members of the great Knesset of the great assembly. So the question is asked: why does the laws of morality give us this line of transmission? Isn't it true about all the Talmud? It's all part of the transmission. The answer is that we know that the obligation to fast on Yom Kippur or the obligation to eat matzah on Pesach, we know that comes from God. You don't need to tell me the transmission. But it could be, that the laws of morality have nothing to do with the Torah, that the laws of morality have to do with, the way people behave in the society that we come from. And the answer is no. The answer is Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai, that we that also is part of our tradition. Being moral is part of our tradition, which I think is really a nice idea.
And I would emphasize that when you look at Kedoshim and you read it on Saturday, on Shabbat anew, you will see, if you take just this segment of Kedoshim and you don't go into the latter stuff that talks about all of these incestuous and sexual and passion and all of that, you will see it is very ethical. When we say ethical between ben adam lechavero, ben man and man, and it's social. And so it's not also, we just heard that this is read in public. This is a rephrasing of the Ten Commandments. It's emphatic, and I think that is so powerful. So I want to go back to what Kedoshim means and how it was taken. But before I do, I can't but talk about one little juxtaposition that came up. And it says in, keep my Sabbaths and honor your parents. And Rabbi, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the standard tradition of the Ten Commandments, you also have the same juxtaposition. You have the fifth commandment is to keep the Sabbath, and the sixth is to honor your parents. Am I right? I didn't look it up.
4 and 5.
Okay.
4 is honor the Sabbath, and 5 is honor your parents. Yeah.
Okay. So Rashi here gives the traditional explanation, because when I I say he gives an explanation, it's based on a question. Why are these two laws always combined? And this is two really high value places where they are combined. And he says, and this is the traditional explanation, that you have to honor your parents, but in a situation where your parents tell you to break the Sabbath, you don't have to listen to them. And I want to ask you point blank, Rabbi, is the question a good question? And how does the answer resonate with you?
I mean, the question is not a good question, but the answer is a good answer.
Ooh, I would go the other way. Why do you think the question's not a good question?
You think the question's a made-up question?
When it talks between 4 and 5 of the 10 Commandments, I think the question is a made-up question. But when you look at our verse here, that combined in one verse, Leviticus 19:2 and 3, it says, you shall revere your mother and father and keep my Sabbaths. I think that's a good question.
Good. Okay. I think that's a good question. I think that's a fine question.
So now we agree it's a good question. Now, why do you think it's a good answer?
I like the answer. You started. You tell me. Do you like the answer?
I don't like the answer. I think the answer, it's a good question. Why are you lumping these two things that have nothing to do with each other together? And we come up in an innocuous situation of, let's call it a Baal Tshuva or something, someone who's more religious than his parents.
The reason I think that it's a bad question is because the only reason they ask the question is because they have an answer. If they didn't have an answer, they would never ask them.
Okay. So,
you know what I mean, right? But before we get to the answer, meaning that, everything in the Torah is next to one another, right? I mean, they could ask that question on every single verse in the Torah. Why is this next to this?
But this is in the same verse. It's in the same verse.
I'm saying, but they could ask that question so many times. The only reason he asked that question is because there's an answer. Now, so the answer is, so what happens if your parents tell you to violate the Shabbos? So it comes to tell you that Shabbos wins over your parents because I am God. Now, that's an interesting moral kind of dilemma, which is, who do you listen to? Your parents or God? That's a great kind of question, because I think you could make a pretty good argument that maybe you should listen to God. Maybe you should listen to your parents. Your parents are your parents.
So I am going to give a radical new interpretation. Is that okay?
I'm listening.
Heard first here on Madlik.
Good.
So in our, and this is not an interpretation that I think is the pashat, the truth, but it is a little bit of drash, and it's looking at it through our modern eyes. For many of us, we relate Shabbat to family. We relate Shabbat to families coming together. There is an Israeli not-for-profit, and it's secular, and it is arguing for some sort of public transportation system on Shabbat. And their argument is, for people who don't have a car, how do you have Shabbat Friday night dinner with your parents? And they are, I have in the source notes their most recent ad from Valentine's Day, and it has a picture of a challah, and it says, you should, ahavta amitit zeh, this is true love, lavo ita la'orachet shishi etzel horim, to come with this challah to the Friday night dinner with her parents. And then it says, we should have some sort of public transportation. But what I do believe is that for all of us, it resonates, the connection between Shabbat and family. And whether that was the original intention or not, but I do think there is a very strong intention, and that we should lean over backwards to make sure that of all of the oneg, all of the joy that you can celebrate on Shabbat, the one joy that we should lean over backwards to make possible is for children to be with their parents.
Good. I like that. I mean, that's her first here on Madlik, but I like it.
So I'm going to have to contact the Yisrael Chofshit and give them some material that came out of our Madlik. Okay, so let's get back to this concept of Kadosh, holy. So Rashi says something very interesting. You shall be holy. This means keeping aloof from forbidden sexual relations. So he studies the same midrash that I quoted a second ago that refers to the two parshiot, the two sections individually. He is basking on that. But what is amazing is the language that he used. Hayu purushim min ha'arayot. So there is an expression, Kedoshim tihiyu, purushim tihiyu. That means you shall be holy, you shall be separate. And in many sense, that falls into the traditional understanding of what holiness is. When I say the mountain is holy, I have to step back. I have to make sure that I don't come into contact with my wife for 3 days. I have to look at it as a holy mountain, sanctity. It is a separation. It is holier than thou. It is an other. It is beyond the material. And that's one level of what he's saying, and therefore it's very natural for him to link our little segment that we read of Kedoshim as a holiness with the next one, which was Arayot, which was the sexual perversions. But I want to talk about the history of this idea, because the English translation of Purushim is actually Pharisees. In other words, Rabbinic Judaism, whether they referred to themselves this way or this was a label that was put on them, were called Purushim. And in a sense, that was their sense of holiness. Am I out on a limb here?
Secret.
Yes.
The reason that the Pharisees refer to a group that became the rabbinic Jews. They were a group during the Second Temple period. There were the Pharisees and there were the Sadducees. In Hebrew, we say the Prushim and the Tzedukim. The Tzedukim were the priests. They were the ones who ran the show. The Purushim, the Pharisees, they were not the ones who were the leadership. They were the average person. How did they make themselves special? Even though they were not the ones who were the priests who worked in the temple, what they did was they separated themselves from forbidden foods, from foods that were tamei, from foods that were ritually impure. So what's amazing is they were known by that practice, and therefore they were called Purushim. So actually it's exactly the same term. The term is people who separate themselves. Exactly the same term. Isn't that interesting?
It is absolutely interesting. And from a certain perspective, there is in the notes, you'll see modern scholarship that I bring. So there's an argument of whether this was a term that was a derogatory term, like these guys are the outsiders, these guys are the rejectionists, or whether it was a term of pride. And you are following a trend where they separated themselves from, and they observe the tithes and the other laws of purity at a higher regard. And I don't think the verdict is not really out on this, but what I want to focus on is, again, this concept, and of those of you who are attenuated to Hebrew, now we've used the same shorish, the same three-letter shorish twice in the same segment. We talked about a parasha, which is a division of the Torah into different segments, and we've talked about now holy is to be separate, and then there was this sect that really either was tagged as separatists or proudly wore the banner of being separate. But they were the same rabbis who wrote in Pirkei Avot that you should not be poresh min hatzibur. So they understood the problems of sectarianism. They understood the problems of this division.
So say it even better. That is, it's okay to be separate in ritual matters. It's not okay to be separate in communal matters. And that's amazing.
I think they struggled with it. I mean, these are the same rabbis who said the temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam. They understood this was a time where there were different sects. And this was a time where we were tearing ourselves apart. And so what I would like to finish with is, and I don't know how I got here, but there was a term that Solomon Schechter came up with, which is a very strange term, and it's called Catholic Israel. And he brought it up in a speech where he dedicated the seminary, the conservative seminary. And you have to understand, when he dedicated that, there was no real orthodoxy in America. He was really trying to address reform and all that. But what he said was amazing, and what the takeaway was amazing. And that he says what unites all of Judaism is that if you look back in history, and you look at, for instance, the Karaites, who were literalists, who were fundamentalists, who only listened to the written word and argued with the Pharisees, he says they triggered a response in Rabbinic Judaism to focus more on the texts, to focus more on our tradition. So what he says is we do have a lot of separation. We have different portions. We have different sects within us. But if you study those portions and if you study those different movements and you bring it all to your present in Torah learning, you have a Catholic Israel, which means a united Israel and a holy Israel. And I think that's a fascinating, fascinating idea as we focus on the connection between Kedusha, holiness, and separation.
That's a great way to end, because to imagine that he said that 120 years ago and we're still talking about it and trying to figure out its relevance for today. That's really a nice idea. So thank you, Geoffrey. I think we really kind of try to get to the bottom of what Kedusha is, but also what the verses at the beginning with Shabbat and parents and, and try to understand the tension there. I think it's a parsha full of great things. Enjoy, everybody. And next week, join us when we'll have a lunch and learn as we study Parshat Emor together.
It will be at 1:00 Eastern, because I will be in the Holy Land in Israel.
Have a great trip. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. You should all be Kodesh. Bye-bye.